Hi everyone, this is Andy from Adaptronic and I'm going to give you quick pointers on how to set up flex fuel on your Adaptronic Select ECU. Flex fuel systems are becoming more and more popular, so here's a quick description of how to set it up, what the limitations are and what the steps you need to take are. First of all, the E420D does not support flex fuel, but all the plug-in Select ECUs and the 440 do support flex fuel. If you have an E420D, then it can be upgraded to a 440 and the wiring is the same. First of all, let's discuss when you need to enable the flex fuel function and to dispel a bit of a myth. The fuel designation EX means that the fuel has X% ethanol. However, people often use this term in an undisciplined way, in the same way that people use Coke to refer to any sort of cola. For example, Caltex sells a fuel product called E-Flex, which is only guaranteed to be somewhere between E70 and E85. Some people refer to this fuel as E85, but it's not E85 and it can vary. So to use this fuel, because you don't know what the ethanol content is going to be, you need to run flex fuel. If on the other hand you're only running E85, on race car for example, then you don't need to set up flex fuel. Also, some people have asked, can we use the dual map function and have one map for E85 and one map for pump gas? You can do it, but the downside with that is that you need to drain the fuel tank and the entire fuel system each time you change the fuels, because there'll be some residual from the previous fuel in the system. It also means that you have to have a separate switch. The driver has to know what to set it to, and it only allows you to change the fuel and ignition maps. It doesn't allow you to change other settings such as coolant enrichments and that sort of function. So if you want to be able to just fill the tank up with whatever ethanol content you want, then you need to run flex fuel. So for this you need a flex fuel sensor. If the Adaptronic's been set up correctly, that is with volumetric efficiency tuning, then setting up flex fuel is fairly easy. First of all, you need to select which input you're going to connect the flex fuel sensor into. You can either use CAS3, Master Vehicle Speed Sensor 2 or Slave Vehicle Speed Sensor 1. Many modern cars have missing tooth crank triggers, which means that in a lot of cases you don't actually need a separate input for the reset, and this means that in most cases CAS3 will be free. The obvious example where it isn't is dual VVTi engines such as the 3SGE Beams engine, and in that case we'll need to use MVSS2 and use MVSS1 as a gearbox output speed sensor rather than reading off the two wheels individually. Then the flex fuel sensor output has to be connected to the input on the ECU. On some of the plug-in ECUs, the CAS3 pin is internal to the ECU, so you'll need to open up the ECU to get to that pin. On others, it's actually wired to the diagnostic port, so that you can just wire the flex fuel sensor into the diagnostic wiring instead. The flex fuel sensor also needs 12 volts and ground. The 12 volts can come from any ignition switch 12 volt source. For example, your ignition coil positive or your injector positive. If you want to, you can also connect it to a display inside the car, which can display to the driver the ethanol content. If you want to do this, then you just need to parallel the sensor output so it goes to both the display and to the ECU. Conventionally, the flex fuel sensor is designed as a flow-through device, where the fuel flows through the sensor after coming out of the pressure regulator on its way back to the fuel tank. If the fuel system flows too much for the flex fuel sensor, then you'll probably need to arrange a bypass or only connect it in series with one of the fuel pumps or something like that. The main requirement is not to let fuel stagnate in the flex fuel sensor, so that it always gets an accurate reading. Then, in the ECU settings, you just need to select the flex fuel source and also select the mode as being 3D interpolation by ethanol content. This allows you to map the additional ignition timing and trim out any fuel requirements as a function of RPM and load. In theory, the fuel correction should be 0 because the ECU already takes into account the difference between the stoichiometric mixture ratio of ethanol at whatever ethanol content you have and E0. So the fuel trim should only be a fine adjustment and should only really be within plus or minus 10%. There are also additional corrections for cold enrichments, cold starting and so on. When it's connected, you should be able to see in the ECU data window first of all that the channel that you've selected is yellow, which means that it's getting pulses from the flex fuel sensor. You should also be able to see the ethanol content, the fuel enrichment amount due to the difference in the stoichiometric ratios, the additional fuel correction amount from the 3D table, and the additional ignition amount from the 3D table as well. One final word of warning, and that is that when the temperature is very low, cars running E85 can be very hard to start. It's fairly common at a racetrack first thing in the morning to see lots of cars cranking for long periods of time and drivers out there with cans of Aerostart and that sort of thing to be able to get them to start when they're actually cold. And this is why Caltex sell E70 during winter and E85 during summer. It's also why in the US the ethanol blends can be down to 50% ethanol concentration. So even though the ECU will account for this, it can't set fire to a liquid mixture. It still needs to be vaporised. You can go to ethanol and you can tune it, but that doesn't mean that your engine's going to start really easily when it's cold, no matter what settings you do in the ECU. Of course each engine's different, but I had to put that warning in there so that not everyone goes out, converts to ethanol, and then no one can start their cars in the morning. In general, what I've found is that ethanol, as opposed to gasoline or petrol, doesn't alone increase power. It does have a much higher octane, which means that you can run more ignition timing, but with the same ignition timing and the same lambda, the engine seems to make the same power regardless of the ethanol content. That's just my experience. I'm sure every engine's different. With some engines, I know that if you have ethanol injected further upstream from the intake ports, then the vaporisation of the ethanol can actually cool down the inlet charge. Gives you a performance benefit, obviously. But if they're just injecting into the ports, into the factory location, then it probably won't give you a benefit on its own. But it does allow you to run more timing, and it certainly gives you more margin against knock. For more information, please go to adaptronicecu.com.